Welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast series by Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. I'm Giuseppe Porcaro, and today we are going to look at the economic impact of the first year of the war in Ukraine, especially through the lenses of the financial sanctions, but not only. For this, I'm happy to host both in Washington, D.C., our senior scholar Nicolas Véron and our non-resident fellow Elena Rybakova. Elena, Nicolas, thank you for joining The Sound of Economics today.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Giuseppe.
You both discussed with me a similar topic over 1 year ago, just a week or so after the war started. And this is also why I wanted to record this episode with both of you. I would like not only to go through the year which has passed and have a reflection on where do we stand, but also review some of the things which you have told me last year and see whether your analysis has changed, evolved, or just been confirmed over this sad and unfortunate year of war. The Russian economy is on the track to be cut in half, Joe Biden said in March last year, as he heralded sanctions brought against Russia after its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Annalena Baerbock, the German foreign minister, vowed that sanctions were hitting the Putin system at its core of power. Liz Truss, her counterpart in the UK at the time, forecast that Vladimir Putin's oligarchs would have nowhere to hide. And EU sanctions, the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said, are working to cripple Putin's ability to finance his war machine. The reality was somewhat different, reflecting what analysts say was hubristic overconfidence in the West about the speed with which the sanctions that were agreed with an unprecedented coordination by the G7 could damage Russia. The Russian economy contracted, but by only 2.2% last year. Unemployment, according to admittedly dubious official figures, now stands at 3.7%. The construction sector has been able to grow significantly, even if the car and electronics industries have suffered, and a bumper harvest has driven growth in the agricultural sector. Russia is now forecast by the International Monetary Fund to grow faster in 2023 and 2024 than the UK. It is hardly financial apocalypse now. As the war approaches its 1-year anniversary, the debate about whether the sanctions have been effective has intensified. So, first things first, where does Russia stand economically 1 year after the war?
So, economically, where Russia stands 1 year after the beginning of the full-fledged invasion is partially in the dreamland and partially in the war economy. So the reason I do mention the dreamland is that the contraction of 2.2% last year also goes alongside unprecedented error on the GDP assessment. So basically the discrepancy, the statistical discrepancy by components when you assess the GDP, which for Russian statistics is not common, but it is a very significant number. Furthermore, we have seen important government spending last year, which clearly has contributed to the positive outcome. But at the same time, we see reported very high double-digit investment growth, including by the private sector, which is sort of hard to believe given the year that we saw last year. And there was recently actually a wonderful paper published by colleagues at the ECB, which tries to look at the broad range of indicators, and they estimate contraction closer to 5% last year. That said, it's not the forecast that I myself forecasted and hoped for. And I think the reason here is because the financial sanctions, which were applied to Russia last year, they have partially turned into trade sanctions. But nonetheless, Russia was rather well prepared to withstand mostly financial sanctions. And they also produced a very strong response, particularly from the Central Bank of Russia. So that insulated the real economy from the financial sector crisis.
Nicola, do you want to add something?
I think there probably were some analysts which engaged in hubristic overconfidence, as you said. But in terms of the financial and other sanctions, you also have to take the long view. And these sanctions are not effective overnight. It is true that there was a hope that there would be an effect of shock and awe, and that there would be immediate destabilization of Russia that has been effectively countered by the very competent management of the capital controls and other measures by the Central Bank of Russia, which have been very effective and well-trained enablers of Putin's aggression. But if you take a longer view, the sanctions are having an effect. And Russia is effectively cut off to a large extent from the global financial system. That means they have no access to external money. That means also that their pile of money that they may use in the course of the war will at some point start to decline. And the fact that the United States, European Union, UK, and others froze or immobilized 300 billion of reserves means that that point will come sooner than would be the case if that action hadn't been taken. So I think the sanctions were the right thing to do. They were proportionate. It was naive to believe they would have an impact immediately on the war operations, and by and large they haven't had, but they were impactful nevertheless. And yes, there were some people who were wishful thinking a year ago. I hope we weren't among them, but that doesn't mean that the impact is negligible.
So, speaking about our conversation last year, Elena, you suggested that Russia had been planning on withstanding some external shocks since 2014. I would like to recall some of the comments you both gave back then.
Yes, so Russia indeed has been planning with their so-called Fortress Russia strategy since 2014, strengthening institutions, building up their reserves, and also cutting down their fiscal spending in order to be more protected from a sort of a more traditional balance of payments like shock that they were expecting from sanctions. Just to remind you, we started with aggressive financial sector sanctions on Russia in 2014, when Russian corporates and banks were disconnected from ability to borrow abroad.
And then Nicolas said,
there was this powerful Fortress Russia strategy. The sanctions on the central bank, which were announced on February 26, have basically undermined the credibility of that strategy, at least in the short term.
So how would you comment about that now? Also, as Nicolas, you started to tell us, can we explain a bit more in depth how the sanctions have been working in the medium term now that we have such a perspective at hand, comparing to last year, which we commented on that just a few days after the sanctions were announced?
Absolutely. The Fortress Russia strategy was the idea that Russia was well prepared for what the US would do in the event of an invasion of Ukraine. What they hadn't anticipated, and where their credibility was undermined, is that it wouldn't be only the US. It's not only the US, the EU, the UK, it's also Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Switzerland, Monaco, Andorra, the British Virgin Islands, places that weren't expected to take action at exactly the time of the invasion. And that caught the central bank by surprise. And that's how they ended up losing access, not losing property, but losing access to 300 billion of their money, which they hadn't desired. So this comment remains valid. Again, the effect of that immobilization of central bank money is not yet visible. Why? Because Russia made a lot of money exporting hydrocarbons last year, and they made more money than they expended in the war, most likely, even so, of course, we don't have exact figures. But what has happened since? The oil prices have gone down. Russia is no longer selling gas to Europe. Europe is buying much less oil than they used to. And if we take the longer view, and of course that depends on how long the war lasts, that means that Russia's receipts, revenue from hydrocarbons, are not on the rise. They are on the decline. We'll see how much they make this year, but it will certainly be less than last year. And that means that the war being very costly, they will hit a financial constraint one day. The fact that the Russian central bank reserves were immobilized means that they come sooner. That's a big deal. If you think of what is generally considered the most effective use of financial sanctions in history, that's probably the sanctions against South Africa to persuade them to get rid of apartheid. These started in the 1960s, were intensified in the mid-80s. people generally say 86. Apartheid was only started to lifted in 1990. Mandela was released in 1990, and the change of regime was in 94. It took years, and this was the most successful example in a case that in a way was easier than Russia because it was a smaller country, more dependent on the countries that were applying sanctions. So I think there is a need for patience, but there is also a need for pride. What happened a year ago when all these countries acted so fast, and I think a lot of credit goes to the key decision makers, among which I would single out Mario Draghi, and the fact that it happened so fast and that so many countries that Russia thought were completely unable to act together did it, I think that has to be a source of pride for everybody who was involved.
Elena?
Well, I think, Nicola summarized it very well, because at the time, I think the central bank did respond skillfully, but they themselves did not expect that they would be so successful in arresting the run on deposits, including at Sberbank. All the key banks experienced severe runs for the first 3 weeks. But over the medium, shortly after the central bank reserves were blocked, I know a lot of people use frozen, arrested and whatnot, but I'd say blocked. The Central Bank of Russia itself, the governor said, look, we've stopped intervening. So they intervened for Thursday, Friday that week. Then over the weekend, the news came of the blocking of the reserves and they had to stop. So they acknowledged that this is, this area of defeat, and they had to go on and freeze basically people's FX deposits. That's what they did. They imposed draconian capital controls. Of course, the reason people didn't come out on the street is when you're met by special forces OMON, if you try to go out with pots and pans on the street, then of course you're sort of much less motivated to do so. So of course that didn't help. And I think it's important for us to keep on digging more into the case studies now of the previous sanctions. I think South Africa is a fantastic example. There's also Iran, Venezuela, and others, because we are here we're basically for the long run, unfortunately. You've seen the speech by President Putin today, the public address, the first one since the full-fledged invasion, and he's clearly digging in his heels. And therefore, sanctions would need to be implemented. We announced a lot of packages, but the packages are unprecedented, but they're also unprecedented for people who are supposed to enforce them and implement them, right? For European Union and also for the US. So this year we need to focus on implementation and enforcement. And then as the time passes, we'll need to adjust them. Just because once you put on a sanction, it doesn't mean that Russia won't find the ways around it. So I'd say 2023 is implementation, enforcement, and when needed, adjustment of sanctions.
Let me zoom in another aspect of what we focused last year, which was the banking sector. I mean, you discussed about the impact of the sanctions on individual cases, because there were individual banks which were targeted by the EU sanctions in the United States and so forth. And perhaps you can give us a brief overview of where we stood then and where we are now on those private banks that were targeted specifically and how this impacted.
I just gave a lot of credit to decision makers for the immobilization of central bank reserves. I think in the area of banking sanctions, so sanctions on individual banks, not the central bank, Europe didn't cover itself in that much glory. And in that area, things were far too low and remain insufficient. So the European Union has a unique tool because it controls SWIFT, which is a Belgian registered financial infrastructure that became a big political football, if you will, at the time of the invasion, because there had been a lot of exaggerated rhetoric about SWIFT, that it was like a nuclear weapon of mass destruction or what have you. And the European Union cut off access of some Russian banks to SWIFT, but only a few, and that was not enough, because the really impactful sanction on banks is to block them from all transactions. So freeze their access, prohibit transactions. That's what is called full blocking sanctions. And the EU is very slow to do that, and is still too slow. So to make a very simplistic schematic description, early on into invasion, the European Union cut off from SWIFT, so de-SWIFted in the current parlance, a bunch of Russian banks that represent about a quarter of the Russian banking sector. Then a few weeks later, they introduced blocking sanctions on those banks. Then in the summer, they de-SWIFted and then blocked Sberbank, which is by far the biggest Russian bank, and a few others, so that at this point, we're at about 2/3 of the Russian banking sector, which is blocked and de-SWIFted. Why 2/3 and not 100% is something that to me is a bit puzzling, and also why it takes a year to come to that statement. The answer, of course, is twofold. One is that there are a number of transactions that the EU is reluctant to cut off because they mean jobs and activity in their own member states. And that is a number of sectors, and Elina has been among the leading scholars to research what the scarce data tell us about that. And the other one is that there are still European-owned banks in Russia, and that putting them under sanctions creates problems for the banks that own them. I don't think that a reason not to sanction those banks, and at this point, of course, the two main ones are Raiffeisen and UniCredit in Russia, and I give credit to UniCredit, if I can say so, for being a long-standing supporter of Bruegel, but that's a separate issue. And there is no reason that the European Union should spare the Russian banking sector because there are these individual links. So I think more action is needed in that department, and it has been far too slow.
And I would continue from Nicholas' brilliant remarks is that we, a few years back, European Commission came out and said it's all geopolitical. Well, for sanctions, it's similar. We need to have an umbrella strategic framework of what we want to achieve with economic statecraft tools. We're talking financial sector sanctions, export controls, others. And on one hand, on the other hand, we have military support, the multi-billion support to Ukraine, the risk to national security of European Union, and also, of course, the life lost every day in Ukraine, right? So we need to put it as a coherent strategy. So when we're deciding to do more or less on the financial sector sanctions, we need to understand that we're spending more in terms of human lives, in terms of the military support. So one arm should not be giving while the other is taking, and vice versa. It should be cohesive strategy. So when we're choosing to exclude certain banks from the sanctions in order to support some companies, and we see that maybe in, whether it's Italy, maybe France, there are some companies that continue to operate with Russia, and therefore they need the banking services, right? And that's why we don't want to cut them off. Or, for example, when there are certain banks that Nicola mentioned continue to finance Russian Federation indirectly, well, that goes against the spirit of us giving military support to Ukraine and protecting national security of European Union. So we need to put this cost and benefits very explicitly on the table rather than very narrowly. And I think that's where I hope the European Union will move next to in terms of thinking strategically about economic statecraft.
Thank you. So there is still quite some work to do in this area. Another related area which we touched last time was the monetary aspect, the monetary policy aspect, and in particular the ruble. I would like to let our listeners re-listen to what you said, Elina, back then.
There are a lot of questions we get exactly on the ruble, and the answer is yes or no. Has it strengthened? Yes, it has strengthened. It's a real strengthening. And the large current account surplus, we've had 58 billion current account surplus.
That's what you said last year, Elina. So how did the currency fluctuation played over the year? And are there any interesting elements that we can take from it?
Well, I think the key interesting element from the currency we can take away is that we did not sanction or put under economic measures Russia's crown jewel, exports of oil and gas. Of course, gas, potentially maybe Russia did itself, but oil and oil products did not come into effect until late last year. So therefore, it's not surprising that Russia has an extraordinary current account surplus of more than $220 billion last year. This is more than double than any historical record Russia has seen. So we gave a present of $220 billion to Russia, and we can discuss why. And therefore, ruble has strengthened. There's no surprise. If anything, the central bank, there is a joke in Russia now that there's nobody done more damage to the Russian budget than the Central Bank of Russia. Because let us not forget, when ruble strengthens, 40% of Russian federal budget revenues are in oil and gas. and therefore that weakens proportionately. So that's the joke. But jokes aside, we have large current account surplus in 2022. We have closed largely the financial account. So it's harder for people to withdraw, and especially for foreign investors, it's impossible to withdraw money from Russia. So that part is locked off. And then, of course, under these conditions, ruble has strengthened somewhat. In fact, we have a paper coming out, hopefully this in the coming days, talking exactly about how much and what price versus quantity effect of the Russian oil export that has contributed to this large current account surplus.
That's going to be a very important and interesting read. And speaking of oil, I go back in the time capsule and recall another of the reflections that in this case Nicolas made back then.
If we want to move on from this situation to a situation where Russia is further undermined, the next step obviously is to decrease EU purchases of oil and gas and also to deter purchases of Russian oil and gas from the rest of the world. And this is where the main discussion is right now.
So we all know what happened, both on the level of the sanctions on this area 1 year later, and at Bruegel we've dedicated a lot of analysis on the energy file, which also Elena just mentioned in terms of importance and crucial stake in all this conversation. So can we comment on that now retrospectively?
You mentioned the work by Bruegel, and since I have no expertise in that area, but I learned a lot from my colleagues. I want to give particular tribute to Georg Zachman, Simone Tagliapietra, also Jeremy Zettelmeier, who has contributed a lot, and a number of other colleagues that I apologize for not mentioning all by name. But they have done a fantastic work in the last 12 months and really, I think, have contributed to better understanding of this. Now, this is a big thing we have learned in the last 11 months, I would say. In the first few weeks after the invasion, we learned two big things. We learned that the Ukrainians were strong and willing to fight, and that was amazing, frankly. And we learned that the Ukraine supporters, the United States, the EU, the UK, also Japan, Korea, and others were doing that together, and that Putin had tried to divide them but had failed. So these 2 points, the resilience and resistance of Ukraine and the cohesion of, if you will, the West, I don't like that word, but at this point I think it is difficult to avoid it. That were 2 big lessons that were learned almost immediately after the invasion. I think what we have learned now is a third big lesson, and this we didn't know a year ago. It is that Putin's oil and gas weapon is blunted. He thought he had critical leverage with the oil and gas sales to Europe, and now he has lost that leverage. Europe has passed the winter with some help from the gods of the weather. But not only that, the European economy has been very adaptable. And that's it. We don't need the Russian oil and gas anymore. So the world markets, of course, still need a little bit of Russian oil. And if Russia stopped exporting oil, that would hit the world markets, but probably not as much as what happened last year. So basically, there's something that was perceived as Russia's biggest leverage, and it's over. You know this famous remark by, I think, Tsar Nicholas II, before World War I, Russia has only 2 friends in the world, its army and navy. And there was this joke in the 2010s that Putin's equivalent to this is Russia has only 2 friends in the world, oil and gas. Well, Russia has lost those friends. So that's a big lesson that we learned. And I think there's a lot of experience accumulated here in terms of the ability of the European Union, too late, too slowly. Of course, we have unanimity for sanctions and so on and so forth, but the European Union has been able not to yield to Putin's hydrocarbon blackmail, and that's a big deal.
And that's indeed a big deal. And again, I want to remind all the analysis we've been doing here at Bruegel. You mentioned all our fellow colleagues who have been working on that. And as I mentioned before, the link is going to be on the show notes with all the analysis we've been doing on that. Another aspect, I know I'm running fast on the different elements that we have to cover, but because there is a lot to cover and not infinite time for this podcast episode. But the other big thing, and this is something that we were also mentioning at the beginning of this conversation, is the fact that Russia seemed to have been adapted. If the European economy has adapted to the new situation and bounce back and be resilient, on the other hand, also Russia has been finding alternative ways, for example, alternative routes to get spare parts and critical technology. And also it has somehow shifted to a war economy. Elena, what can we say about that?
Well, I think it is indeed a dangerous shift that we've observed, because it allows Russia now to retool. And this is exactly what we're trying to prevent with sanctions, including with the export controls for Russia. So we also see it already in industrial production last year, where the industries that are more directly linked to war machinery have performed better versus other industries that have contracted. Of course, the fact that you're adding the missiles and uniforms to GDP growth, it is not clear it's a sustainable medium-term GDP growth, and also is good for your potential output estimation, but nonetheless, it is recorded in the numbers. What I think is critical here, the fact that Russia is allowed to retool. We talked a lot about last year about the difficulties that Russia might encounter in terms of finding alternative suppliers. Right, China, other countries do not produce the critical technology that many Western firms or European or American firms produce. However, it seems that not just China has stepped in to supply Russia, and now it's by far the largest overall trade partner for Russia, surpassing European Union. But also it seems that we're beginning to see evidence, and we just published a paper on that, is that third countries, whether it's China, Turkey, UAE, and a few others, are beginning to channel the critical technologies from the West, maybe German produced or Netherlands or US produced, and they're channeling it and sending it onwards to Russia. And I think this is the area we can do much more work. Again, I don't want to criticize the authorities who have done unprecedented measures, especially in the area of export controls. Financial sanctions we've been working on, especially OFAC, since 2010 onwards, and it's required a lot of large fines, including on banks, in order for everybody to eventually fall into place after 2014 onwards. Export controls is something very new. US and Europe are not used to leading with export controls. And here we're definitely lacking infrastructure for enforcement. And also we need to go back to third parties like Turkey and not go with the long laundry list that we want everything to be complied with. I think it's more realistic saying, look, these are the critical items. That's what we want from you, or else. And else what can it be? For Turkey, it's critical to have access to European markets. It's also important to have financing. It also has close relationship with European banks. So we can sort of give tit for tat, like, look, we do not want you to send German drones to Russia for the war effort. And in return, we can talk about something else. Or there could also be a transatlantic sort of NATO group alliance on sanctions as well during the period of war. And that brings us back to the coherent economic statecraft strategy.
Nicola, do you want to add?
I think that's now the main front, right? I mean, the central bank, we did what we could early in the war. That was the right action. There is now a debate on confiscation. I personally think this is not the thing to do now, maybe in the future, but not now. So that's a done deal. The banks, we talked about it. We need to finish the job. I see no reason why the entire Russian banking sector shouldn't be blocked by the EU. But that's not going to make a critical difference. It's going to further undermine Russia, but not in a way that will change the game. Energy, most of the heavy lifting has been done in terms of EU consumption. Of course, now we need to persuade other nations like, India, Turkey, and others to stop buying Russian oil. That will be difficult. It's not going to happen anytime soon. But that's where future action can be. And I think then it leaves all the other non-financial, non-energy things that are under trade sanctions and that Elena just mentioned. That's where there is the most leakage in the EU sanctions. There isn't much problem of compliance in terms of the central bank reserves or even blocking the banks, but there's a lot of leakage in terms of export controls and what we do for trade more generally. So here we need more infrastructure. David O'Sullivan, a former senior official of the Commission, has been appointed to coordinate the implementation of sanctions. That's progress, but I think we need much more capacity building, both at the EU level, at the level of individual member states, and at the international level with the allies in the pro-Ukraine coalition, so that these sanctions can be effective. Turkey is a big concern. Elina has highlighted and singled it out, and I think because it's so close to Europe and also a member of NATO, that's one point of particular attention.
So now, looking a bit to the future, you started already, Nicola, to see what are going to be the next steps. We are obviously not in the right position to make predictions, but I would nevertheless ask you how we could, obviously not from the military point of view, but from the economic point of view, have at least an attempt to forecast a couple of scenarios. So the first scenario would be that the war continues at the same slow pace and that some sort of status quo keeps on the front for a longer time. And the second, in case of an acceleration in the resolution of the war in the next, let's say, 6 to 12 months or something like this. I don't want to have just one scenario presented over there because we are not with the crystal ball, and it's very, very hard, especially very, very sensitive. But in these two cases, how do you see the economic story going forward on these both sides that we've been looking at today, which is one side, the Russian economy and how it's reacting, adapting, or living with the war that they caused, and on the other side, the EU and the US and the other allied parties which are trying to counteract?
Maybe I start and let Nicola sort of wrap it up. I think it's important, what Nicola flashed out earlier is that it's non-zero substitution for Russian oil and gas in Europe. And I think that was a critical moment sometime in spring when we all realized, as we know, for the economists, if we have a kink in the model, it's very problematic. If we have some sort of substitution, it already gives us hope. And here time is on the side of European Union, because we've seen some substitution. The coefficient may be small in the beginning, but then there is learning, and then there is a cumulative effect of time with the substitution. And that gives sort of more and more room for European economy to grow. That said, of course, we have to be mindful with China, zero COVID policy and reopening. It will have an impact on global commodity markets. It will have an impact on Russia, on LNG. And let us not forget that European Union was still importing long-term contracts, Russian LNG at cheaper prices. And therefore, we need to rethink that strategy. Even though there are wonderful new terminals built in Germany, and there will be more built in Germany and across Europe, but there has to be LNG to be bought. And we need to see more supply from potentially US and other countries if there will be more demand from Asia, including from China, from South Africa, South Korea, from Japan. And there are risks stemming from that area. Nonetheless, the substitution effect is working and time are working in European Union favor on one hand. On the other hand, we have sanctions that continue to drag on Russian economy, and the fact that we're recording positive GDP growth because of more missiles flying in the direction of Ukraine doesn't make Russia a stronger economy. So I think the time is definitely in European Union favor. We need to be realistic expectations about the effect of the sanctions, that they take time. At the same time, we shouldn't just rest on our laurels. And again, I'm coming back to the same point, 2023, implementation and enforcement and adjustment of the sanctions. They will not work by themselves. It's not that we pass a package and then somehow magically it gets implemented. Even the OFAC sanctions on the financial sector took almost 5 years for the banks to digest that they need to take them seriously. And now here we have something very new, and there are many companies who think that, wait a second, if I'm not caught, if I don't get a fine, I'm actually fine to continue doing what I'm doing.
Nicola?
Giuseppe, you said Russia on one side, the EU and the other allies on the other side. Of course, in the middle, there is Ukraine. And Ukraine has been suffering a lot economically as well as in human terms from the aggression. So I think we need to look at the big picture here. The Ukrainians are fighting for us Europeans. They're defending us. They're our bulwark. They're our fortification against aggression. They have earned a lot from us, in not only in moral terms, but in kind of cold calculation of what is in our interest. And I think this underlies, of course, the commitment that the EU has given to provide a perspective of Ukrainian accession to the EU, and that it is critically important to keep that active and to make it happen eventually. It's enormously difficult. We're all aware of the institutional issues, the governance issues, the corruption issues in Ukraine, and they're not to be sugar-coated. But that doesn't offset the fact that Ukraine basically has earned its membership of the European Union, and it will need to happen. So that also has financial consequences. I think another success from a low base of the European Union is that they have belatedly, and it has taken shamefully too long, but belatedly the European Union has gotten its act together in terms of financial support, ongoing financial support to Ukraine. Last year, we made commitment, we didn't deliver, we didn't disperse the funds that we had said we would, and that was a shame. Conversely, this year, there's a clear year-long program, 18 billion of macro-financial assistance plus. Actually, the first 2 months have been disbursed in January, so we're ahead of the plan. And we will need to provide more, both during the war, as long as it lasts, for the Ukrainian government to be able to pay the bills, and after the war for reconstruction, because that will be a big outlay. But we can afford it, because Ukraine is not that big compared to the European Union. The European Union is rich. We have the means, with or without new borrowing, to provide that money. So I think this is where the action is. Again, credit to the European Union for having belatedly been able to provide credible, ongoing financial, non-military financial support on top, of course, of the military aid to the Ukrainian government. Probably more will be needed, and we have to prepare for that.
Thank you. And on this note, unfortunately, we have to close, hoping that in a year's time we will be here again. I would like already to invite both of you, Nicola and Elina, to record another podcast, but hoping that it's not going to be a second anniversary of an ongoing war, but a peace and reconstruction podcast with a brighter outlook. And I would like to remind everyone that, as usual, you can read in open access all the analysis by our scholars on our website, www.bruegel.org. Thanks a lot, Nicola and Elina.
Thank you, Giuseppe.
And thanks to our listeners for joining The Sound of Economics. Until next time, bye-bye.